Most people who study the Second World War understand the scale of destruction, the battles, the shifting fronts. What often receives less attention is the quiet, disciplined fight for survival that took place far from the front lines, inside farmhouses, bombed-out apartments, forest huts, and frozen city blocks. In the winters of 1941 through 1945, millions of European families did not simply endure hardship. They developed systems. They improvised insulation strategies, rewired food economies, repurposed fuel sources, and restructured households around cold-weather survival. These were not random acts of desperation. They were deliberate, adaptive responses to prolonged logistical collapse. If you value in-depth historical analysis that looks beyond battle maps and into the lived mechanics of survival, subscribe to the Survival Record. Today, we're examining the overlooked winter methods that kept civilians alive when infrastructure failed and temperatures became as lethal as artillery. When supply lines collapsed, civilian survival became a logistical problem. In much of Eastern and Central Europe, winter survival during wartime was directly tied to the breakdown of supply networks. Once railways were bombed, coal shipments disrupted, and agricultural regions occupied or scorched, civilians faced a stark reality: survival depended on local self-sufficiency. In the Soviet Union during the winter of 1941–42, entire regions were cut off from organized fuel deliveries. Urban heating systems, already strained, failed outright. Families responded by reverting to pre-industrial heating logic. Apartments were consolidated. Multiple families crowded into a single room, sealing off the rest of the dwelling to reduce heat loss. Doors were hung with thick blankets, windows were covered in paper, fabric, or cardboard to create crude insulation layers that trapped air. The goal was not comfort, it was heat retention per unit of fuel burned. In occupied Poland and parts of Ukraine, families dismantled fences, furniture, and even wooden outbuildings for firewood. This practice was not chaotic destruction, it was prioritized sacrifice. Items were chosen based on structural redundancy. A shed wall might be removed while preserving roof support. Furniture with thick hardwood was burned first, leaving lighter frames for later. The underlying principle was caloric efficiency, translated into fuel logic. What burns hottest and longest relative to its value? The collapse of centralized systems forced civilians to think in terms of resource triage. This approach allocates scarce fuel toward maximum heat density and minimal exposure, mirrors later military cold-weather survival doctrine, which emphasizes microenvironment control over large area heating. Urban gardening and hidden livestock became winter insurance policies. By 1942, food rationing across Europe had become insufficient in caloric terms, especially in cities. Winter intensified the crisis because fresh food supplies dwindled and preservation stores ran low. Families that survived repeatedly were those who treated summer and autumn not as seasonal cycles, but as preparation windows. In Germany, the Netherlands, and parts of France, urban gardening was aggressively expanded. Every courtyard, vacant lot, and roadside verge was converted into small-scale agriculture. Root vegetables, potatoes, turnips, beets, were prioritized because they stored well in cellars without advanced preservation technology. Cabbage was fermented into sauerkraut to preserve vitamin C, reducing scurvy risk during long winters. In occupied Eastern Europe, hidden livestock became a critical survival strategy. Rabbits and chickens were raised indoors or in concealed backyard structures to avoid requisition by occupying forces. Rabbits in particular were efficient converters of kitchen scraps into protein. They required little space, reproduced quickly, and could be processed quietly. This small animal strategy resurfaced decades later in survivalist and resilience planning because it demonstrated something important. Sustainable winter protein does not require large grazing land. It requires low visibility, minimal feed, and rapid reproduction cycles. Food preservation methods were equally deliberate. Root cellars were insulated with straw and earth to maintain temperatures just above freezing. Families rotated stores carefully, consuming perishable items first, and guarding calorie-dense staples, grains, dried legumes, for the coldest months when fuel shortages made cooking more difficult. Winter survival was not just about having food, it was about aligning caloric availability with fuel availability. Cooking methods shifted toward one-pot meals that conserved both heat and ingredients. Communities survived longer when they formalized cooperation rather than relying on charity. One of the most overlooked survival mechanisms during World War II winters was structured mutual aid. In besieged cities like Leningrad, informal neighbor networks evolved into semi-organized systems. Residents pooled fuel, shared cooking schedules, and coordinated watch rotations to prevent theft of scarce resources. In rural Yugoslavia and parts of Greece, villages established collective wood-gathering expeditions before heavy snowfall. Rather than each household risking isolation, labor was centralized. Wood was cut, transported, and distributed according to need and capacity. The elderly and injured were allocated more fuel per capita because their cold tolerance was lower. This was not ideological collectivism, it was pragmatic thermodynamics. Shared labor reduced exposure time in extreme conditions. Centralized cooking reduced total fuel consumption. Collective risk management lowered mortality. These patterns later influenced post-war civil defense planning in both Eastern and Western Europe. The lesson was clear: decentralized households with no coordination waste energy and increased vulnerability. Structured cooperation extends survival horizons. Improvised insulation methods often mattered more than additional fuel. In many regions, fuel was simply unavailable in sufficient quantity. The only viable solution was heat conservation. Families layered floors with straw covered by fabric to reduce conductive heat loss. Walls were lined with newspapers, which trap air effectively when stacked in layers. In bomb-damaged cities, rubble itself was repurposed as windbreak material. Sandbags, originally for blast protection, doubled as thermal mass barriers against drafts. Clothing adaptation was equally strategic. Civilians layered natural fibers, wool over linen. Because wool retains insulating properties even when damp. In areas where wool was scarce, quilted garments stuffed with rags or straw were used as makeshift insulation. Children often wore multiple oversized garments simultaneously to trap air between layers. The principle underlying these methods, control airflow, trap air pockets, minimize exposed surface area, is identical to modern cold-weather survival training. The difference is that civilians learned it under prolonged scarcity rather than controlled instruction. The German Army's disastrous winter in 1941–42 highlighted a parallel truth. Inadequate insulation can cripple even a mechanized force. Civilian practices developed organically, often outperformed military planning in local adaptation. Black markets functioned as survival arteries, not mere criminal enterprises. In many occupied territories, black markets are remembered primarily as profiteering systems. That interpretation overlooks their structural role in winter survival. Official rations frequently fell below subsistence levels. In the Netherlands, during the hunger winter of 1944–45, urban residents traveled by bicycle into rural areas to barter valuables for food. Jewelry, linens, and heirlooms were exchanged for potatoes and grain. These exchanges were risky but systematic. Black market networks redistributed food from agricultural zones to urban centers when official channels failed. Prices were high and inequities were severe, but the alternative for many was starvation. From a survival perspective, these informal economies demonstrated a key lesson. When centralized systems collapse or are weaponized, parallel distribution networks emerge. Modern resilience theory acknowledges that shadow economies can stabilize populations under extreme strain. They are inefficient and morally complex, but often life-preserving. Fuel substitution required technical improvisation at the household level. Coal shortages forced experimentation. In parts of France and Belgium, civilians pressed peat or mixed coal dust with clay to create makeshift briquettes. In rural Soviet areas, dried manure, long used as fuel in Central Asia, was adopted more widely in European territories unfamiliar with it. Cooking devices were modified, metal scrap was fashioned into compact stoves designed for small rooms. These concentrated heat output and reduced fuel needs. Chimneys were narrowed or patched to improve draft efficiency. The underlying principle was combustion optimization. Households that understood airflow, draft control, and fuel density survived winters with fewer resources. These same principles later informed small unit field stove design and civilian emergency preparedness manuals. The war did not invent these techniques. It reintroduced older, rural knowledge into urban environments that had grown dependent on industrial supply chains. Psychological discipline was as critical as physical preparation. Long winters under wartime conditions imposed severe psychological strain. Darkness, cold, and hunger compounded uncertainty. Families that survived consistently often maintained strict routines. Meal times were fixed. Fuel consumption was scheduled. Work tasks were distributed. This structure preserved morale and reduced panic-driven waste. Children were assigned responsibilities appropriate to their age: collecting kindling, sealing drafts, monitoring food stores. Participation reinforced purpose. Historians examining diaries from Warsaw, Leningrad, and Berlin note that households with defined roles experienced lower breakdown rates. Survival was treated as a shared project rather than an individual burden. Modern military cold weather doctrine similarly emphasizes routine and task orientation to counteract cognitive decline under stress. World War II civilians discovered this through necessity. These winter adaptations reshaped post-war preparedness thinking. After 1945, governments on both sides of the emerging Cold War studied civilian endurance under siege and deprivation. Urban gardening programs persisted. Civil defense manuals incorporated advice on home insulation and emergency fuel storage. Strategic grain reserves were expanded. The experience of civilian winter survival influenced doctrine beyond Europe. Cold weather training in NATO and Warsaw Pact forces emphasized layered clothing, compact heating, and ration discipline, all lessons mirrored in civilian improvisations. More broadly, these winters revealed the fragility of centralized systems. Industrial societies discovered that infrastructure failure does not produce immediate collapse if households retain adaptive capacity, but that capacity depends on retained knowledge of food storage, fuel efficiency, cooperation, and restraint. The deadly winters of World War II were not survived through heroics alone. They were endured through planning, sacrifice, technical improvisation, and collective discipline. These methods rarely appear in grand strategic histories, yet they determined who lived long enough to see liberation. Remembering these survival systems matters because they expose a different dimension of war, one measured not in offensives but in endurance. They remind us that resilience is built long before crisis arrives, and that small, practical decisions compound over months into life or death outcomes. If you value serious, detailed explorations of the overlooked mechanics of survival in history, subscribe to The Survival Record and share this video with others who believe the past still has practical lessons to teach.